Alright, welcome to part 2. Like I said last time, if you're not a loser, you're a Christian, you're in the right spot. If you are a loser, stay tuned into the channel, we'll fix that. So, the Kalam argument, what I believe to be the best argument for God's existence because of its simplicity. Now listen, we aren't geeks, okay? So we aren't going to get into the scholarly nitty-gritty terminology nerd talk. While I do understand and can teach the more complicated version, this will be a simplified version that everyone can understand and you can easily present to other people. I have nothing against the more traditional Kalam argument, as illustrated by William Lane Craig, who's a G by the way. But most people get lost or confused by the second premise, or some people even get confused by the first premise. I have a funny story about that. And also, speaking of premises, let's cover that really quickly. A premise is essentially a point within an argument, which in this case is a deductive argument. Meaning if the premises are true, then the conclusion is logically unavoidable. So let's begin. So let's begin with premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Like I said, we're keeping this simple. This is a very common sense principle. If you look into your room, I'm in a room right now, right? I'm looking at the stuff. I have some supplement bottles. I have a screen here. I have a keyboard, a mouse, a computer. All this stuff began to exist and has a cause. For me to say that this isopropyl alcohol I'm holding in my hand right now came from nothing is absurd. I think everyone would agree with that. So I really don't think we have to go into too much detail about this. In order to deny this premise, you are forced to say something completely unreasonable when all the jargon is put aside. I'll show you an example here.
There is nothing here, I will concede that, but it's an extremely interesting form of nothing. There was nothing originally. There is nothing here now, but it's through whatever event took place at the inception of the universe, it became an interesting form of nothing.
This isn't very convincing, is it? And behind all the convincing rhetoric that people like Christopher Hitchens mastered, this is what it really comes down to. Unless, of course, they say nothing became something, which again suffers the same problem, it does not make any sense. Now, a funny objection I had, I was talking to somebody and I was bringing up, the first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause, and he brought up two things that are really weird objections. So one of them was, people are born without limbs. I don't see how that's an objection to the first premise. Then the other one was, animals get cloned, that doesn't have a cause. But the thing is, the cause is in the word clone. They're cloned, that's the cause for their whatever. You get the point. I don't think there's any good objection to this. I talked to a lot of people. I've seen a lot of things. No good objections to the first premise. I miswrote that. Okay. So premise 2 is actually the universe began to exist. Not whatever begins to exist has a cause. That was the first premise. Okay. I'm going to edit this. Alright, it's going to be a great edit. It's going to be beautiful. We're going to make video editing great again. We're going to change that. It's going to be beautiful. Now, this is usually the most jargon-filled point, so I'll make it as simple as possible. We can quote people like Alexander Van Lincoln, who's a cosmologist at Tufts University, who asserts the universe began to exist. The super nerd Lawrence Krauss says the universe probably began to exist. The Big Bang Theory implies the universe began to exist. And the scientific consensus and all evidence points to the universe beginning to exist. Evidence aside, we can also posit that a universe beginning to exist is a better explanation than the universe being eternal. Now this delves a bit into the philosophy. I'll let William Lane Craig explain this.
When you mentioned an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, you mentioned Hilbert's Hotel.
Yes.
Could you explain that example and what that is and how that relates
yes,
to God?
I'll try to do this very briefly. David Hilbert was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. And to illustrate the strange nature of the actual infinite, he invites us to imagine a hotel that has an infinite number of rooms in it. Moreover, he says, imagine that every room is occupied. Now, you have to have that firmly in mind. There is a flesh and blood person in every single room throughout the Infinite Hotel. Now, Hilbert says, suppose somebody shows up at the guest registry wanting to check in. The proprietor says, of course, no problem. And he moves the person who was in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2, he puts in room 3. The person who was in room 3, he puts in room 4, on out to infinity. As a result, room 1 now becomes vacant, and the new person is easily accommodated. And yet, before he came, all the rooms were already full. Then Hilbert says, imagine that an infinite number of new guests show up at the front desk, and again, every room is already occupied. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the guest in room 1 into room 2. He moves the guest who was in room 2 into room 4. He takes the guest who was in room 3 and puts him in room 6, putting every guest in the room number double his own. Well, since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, right? All of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and therefore the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. And yet before they arrived, every room was already full. I think these sorts of absurdities show the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things, because there's nothing about the illustration that hangs on it being a hotel. When you have an actual infinite, you generate these kinds of crazy situations that I think are plausibly, metaphysically impossible.
So yeah, the evidence points to the universe beginning to exist, and the philosophical arguments for beginning to exist check out as well. Now, premise number 3, therefore the universe has a cause, this just logically follows, doesn't need to explain. The first 2 premises are true, then this follows. Now, premise 4, the creator of the universe could only be God. I think this is pretty simple. What other than God can cause a universe? The cause for the universe must be all-powerful, all-knowing, eternal, and personal. Eternal is very important, and the only other thing that immediately comes to mind that is eternal are numbers. But obviously numbers don't fit any of the other criteria. All-powerful, obviously, because to create everything, he needs to be all-powerful. All-knowing, he needs to know everything to create everything. Very simple. I don't think you could really deny premise number 4. Reasonably, at least. Now, I'm going to cover this one objection because it just came to mind that is so bad. Who created the creator? Now, within this argument, that's not even a rational objection because there's a key word here. I'm going to beautifully underline it. Eternal. Eternal. Our first premise is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Eternal things don't begin to exist. So it's not even a rational objection given the context of the argument, but even if, that would just create a paradox, because how could an all-powerful, all-knowing God, top of the top, be created, that he couldn't be God? So, who created the creator objection is just it's very dumb. You know, like, you think about it for a few seconds and you realize it doesn't make any sense, but it's such a popular objection. I don't know why. I've known it since I was like 6. That objection's stupid. Anyways, on to the conclusion of the deductive arguments. Remember, in the deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion logically follows. You cannot avoid the conclusion if the premises are true. The conclusion is God is the cause for the universe. And there it is, the simplified Kalam. If you like a more in-depth geeky one, I'll link William Lane Craig's breakdown of it. Now, if you'd like free resources on these subjects, then sign up for the first link in the description. It'll be sent over 100% for free, and also subscribe for future content. Thank you for watching.